Hey everyone, my name is Rooster and welcome back to Mechabellum, and welcome to an updated version of a video I made a while back about what techs you should be running on your units. Now, ever since that video came out, we've had a lot of extra units added into the game, as well as a bunch of new techs, and so I think it's only fitting to have a revised version of said video. The way that this is going to work is that I'll be going through each of the units we currently have, from left to right, top to bottom, and I'll make sure to put the timestamps down below in case you're looking only at a select few units. If you want to have a full view of all the techs I'll be running by the end, then there'll be a timestamp for that as well. Currently, you'll see that some units only have a couple of techs that are selected. The reason for this is that these are the techs I think are mandatory, and then I'll add onto that the options you have to fill the remaining slots. So, without further ado, let's get into it, because I don't want this to be an extremely long video. So we'll start with the crawler. On crawler, I think replicate, drill, and loose formation are mandatory. The reason for this is that replicate and drill are really helpful techs in crawler fights, and you will often find yourself having to click them, especially if you're playing against someone who's playing aggressively, or if you are the one playing aggressively. Replicate has a ton of value. If you're able to get some replicate procs off, you'll make more chaff, and it'll be all the more annoying for your opponent to deal with your board. Drill is a very nice tech in case you want to counter replicate, because same level crawlers with impact drill will usually be winning from same level crawlers that only have replicate, and so you can save yourself some money there. Also, the tech is slightly less expensive, right? So keep this in mind whenever you are facing an opponent that either clicked replicate already or you think is about to click replicate. Loose formation is fantastic for late game boards. It basically has a similar effect as something like Shielded Fang, as it makes a lot of chaff clear units very unhappy with the crawlers. The way that these units will be spreading out will make them much harder to clear, and so the splash range on some of these chaff clear units will simply not be enough. Really crucial tech for late game, whether you're playing aggro or whether you are playing standard. Now, that leaves a final slot open. I generally run Subterranean Blitz because I think it's a nice addition to something like the loose formation, especially if your opponent, seeing loose formation, tries to get some ground effect on the board like fire. Underground may allow you to get the crawlers through the fire anyway. Other options that you might go for is something like Mech Rage if you really want to play only aggro, but I wouldn't really recommend this. It's a bit of a niche tech. An Acid Explosion is kind of similar. It does have its uses. It can be good against giants that happen to be on the line, and it can especially be good against stuff like, well, worms, which are giants as well, but they tend to run in, so that helps you with the acid pools that will be created when the crawlers die. So, that is the crawlers covered. Onto the Fangs. Over here, I have already selected 4 techs. The reason for this is that Fangs only have 5 techs, and generally speaking, I think Ignite is more versatile than something like Armor Piercing. If you don't want to play carry Fangs, then generally speaking, the 2 techs that are the most important are going to be Range and Portable Shield. Range will allow you to deal with things like Wasps or late game if you need to, and Portable Shield is just going to be nice to slow down enemies if they don't have fast attacking units and are more so relying on things like Arclights or Sledges to chaff clear. Arclights are up next. Now, with Arclights, the techs that I am running, or that I think are at least mandatory, are going to be Range, Elite Marksman, and EMP. Range and Elite Marksman are simply nice because they allow you to shoot chaff from further away. It also keeps your Arclights safer, which means that they don't run as much of a risk of getting sniped early on, which would get rid of your chaff clear, and problems will ensue. So yeah, these are really nice. Elite Marksman just gives that little bit of extra range once you get some levels. EMP is fantastic. It's quite cheap, and it allows you to deactivate techs on certain units if you need to. Arclights are pretty good at doing this. Now, for your final tech, you have a couple of options. You can either go Charge Shot here, or you can run something like Anti-Aircraft Ammunition. If you really want to, you can also drop the Electromagnetic Shot and go for Charge Shot, and really like run a full carry Arclight setup where you can deal with both ground and air threats. but generally speaking, I prefer to run something like this, where I can go into carry arcs, but I don't necessarily need my Arclights to shoot at air units, and I'd rather get a dedicated anti-air option for that. Armor enhancement is also possible to take if you want to, for like aggressive plays. If your opponent is playing something like Typhoons or Vulcans or Mustang, then armored Arclights can be a bit of an annoyance for them. But with how many good techs there are available on Arclights currently, I just can't seem to fit it on the tech bar. Next up, we have Marksman. Here again, you will see a trend where range and elite Marksman is being picked. Range is almost always one of the best techs on any unit, so that goes without saying. And then we have elite Marksman, which allows the Marksman to become one of the best scaling single target DPS units in the game. It has a incredibly high base range, and so this will allow it to basically become one of the units with the furthest range in the game, and it also gives it that crucial extra damage. Once you get up to level 3, level 4 Marksman, you'll be able to deal with bigger targets a bit more easily. You have a bunch of options then. You can either decide to play a very aggressive setup, so if you only want to play aggro and you want to try something like Assault Mode Marksman, then you can try something like Assault Mode and Shooting Squad. Keep in mind that this will pretty much only allow you to play aggro. If you don't want to play aggro necessarily, or if you just want to have the option, you can also decide to go for something like Aerial Specialization. This will allow you to kind of play both standard and aggro. It's a bit more versatile in that sense. If you want to play only standard, I would recommend that you take Aerial Spec and something like Electromagnetic Shot. You can also decide to go for something like Double Shot here instead of Electromagnetic Shot, and saying, I'm just going to kill whatever unit I am shooting at rather than trying to disable it. And you can even decide to take off something like Aerial Specialization and run like a full carry setup with quick reload and double shot for maximum DPS output. In general though, I think that the safest option to play in standard is still going to be Aerial Specialization, because this will allow you to deal with some aggressive pushes that people might do using Wraith or Overlords. And then something like EMP can be really nice if you face certain giants like Vulcans or Melters with multiple techs. If you can get the lock on and disable them, you'll have a much easier time dealing with the opponent's board. So this is the setup I would generally be running. Onto Mustang. Now for Mustang, range again, one of the most important techs. Aerial Specialization also mandatory. This will allow you to deal very well with air units of all kinds. The only problems that you may have is like high level Wraith with something like regen or armor, but otherwise Mustangs will be able to deal with pretty much any air threat as long as they have these two techs. And then you have a bunch of options. Missile Interceptor can be interesting, but I would generally recommend against taking this. I think that there are better anti-missile options out there, and the problem with Mustang is that the Mustangs will start shooting at the missiles rather than shoot at the opponent's units, which makes you lose some efficiency. So you're kind of trading the fact that the opponent's missiles don't land for your Mustangs not shooting at enemies. So for that reason, I tend to not run it right now. Or I do have it, but it's not the most important. High explosive ammo can be nice to deal with chaff, especially with something like loose formation being added into the game. This can allow you to deal a bit better with enemy chaff late game if it does become a problem. It's especially very good against something like shielded Fangs. And then armor piercing is also an option that you have available to you if you want to go for some carry Mustangs. If you find yourself having a bunch of levels, then AP can be really nice. So currently my setup would look something like this, but you could also try and run Missile Interceptor for that edge scenario where you find yourself getting like Mustangs for free from the free unit rounds, and then maybe if your opponent has a lot of missiles, you can find yourself clicking this. Alright, on to Sledgehammer. For Sledgehammer, the two mandatory techs are again going to be range, and then I'm going to recommend Mechanical Rage as well. This will allow you to speed up your sledges if you're playing aggro, which gets you in a bit faster, and it also reduces their attack interval and makes it a bit easier for your sledges to deal with things like chaff, which is going to be really, really useful if you want to play a comp that is based around sledgehammers. Other techs that I think are really useful are going to be something like Electromagnetic Shot, which will allow you to disable enemy techs if you are going for the carry build. And then finally, you basically have a choice of something like Field Maintenance or either something like Armor for the most versatile build, I would say. Alternatively, you can go full carry, where you would be running AP as well, but keep in mind that this will kind of stop you from having frontline sledges. I would personally run something like Armor Enhancement or even Field Maintenance, but I do know some people like running AP and it can be a fun playstyle. So try out the different options and see what fits you. Stormcallers, same thing again. We'll see range showing up. I think Incendiary Bomb, even though it's recently been nerfed, is still really, really important. The ground effect here is just so powerful, especially late game when you have to deal with things like late Fangs or even late shielded Fangs and loose formation crawlers. Fire will allow you to chaff clear somewhat effectively still, and therefore it has too much value for me to take it off the bar. And this is mainly when I'm talking about a situation where both you and your opponent are playing standard and are far away from one another. EMP, I think, is really good as well. Stormcallers have a high base range, and so they tend to stay safe for pretty much the entirety of a round, which means that with EMP, there will be a unit that will be able to shoot multiple salvos all the way through the round and keep units EMP'd without being really at risk of dying. That leaves a final slot where I would currently put something like High Explosive. Now, High Explosive, I would recommend playing, especially if you're playing a bit more aggressively. This can be a really nice tech. It's also really good early on, but it tends to fall off a bit in the late game to something like Incendiary Bomb. Other options is you could also decide to take off HE and run Launcher Overload if you really want to make sure that you can spam Stormcallers and just overwhelm anti-missile answers if your opponent goes for that. But currently this will be my setup. Steelballs, range, again, no need to explain. Energy absorption is fantastic. This will allow your Steelballs to heal back up once they lock onto something, and this really, really increases their survivability. So often this will be one of the first techs that you click. Mechanical Division can be really nice. It's not something that I click very often, but it does have its uses, and it can be really annoying to deal with for your opponent, especially if their chaff clear is a bit lacking. This can be a really nice tech, and that leaves open a final slot where I would recommend you either take Armor Enhancement or Damage Sharing. And out of these two, Armor Enhancement is a bit more common, as it can stop a lot of units that you will see more often on the board, like something like Vulcans, maybe Mustangs or Typhoons, and yeah, for that reason I prefer running this. Damage Sharing can be nice, but it is more of a gut shot tech, so you want to tech this when you think that you can beat your opponent within the next round or two, because otherwise you run at the risk that either a Melter can kill your entire line of sledges because they're all linked, or even something like a Scorpion will have a very high efficiency if it's able to hit the whole pack. This brings us to Tarantula. Now, with Tarantula, again, range and then Spider Mine are the techs that I think are mandatory. Spider Mine is kind of the tech that defines Tarantulas, and so I think it's really nice. This can be fantastic if you're playing aggro to overwhelm your opponent and add these annoying extra units to the board every 15 seconds that have a pretty decent amount of health and can be hard to take down. It also boosts the DPS of Tarantulas quite significantly. These mines aren't meant to chaff clear. They have a very small explosion radius, but they do a good amount of damage, and so they can allow spiders to deal with slightly more tanky units, which they wouldn't be able to kill just by shooting them. Other techs that I would recommend would currently be something like Mech Rage and High Explosive Ammo. High Explosive Ammo has been buffed recently and it is rather cheap, and it does allow you to chaff clear a bit better, especially if your opponent goes for, say, early shielded Fangs. This may definitely help. Mech Rage can be nice, but it's often a tech that you will only click very, very late into the match. Other options, you could find yourself running something like Field Maintenance, but it is a very tempo heavy tech and you're kind of relying on snowballing if you want to run this. You could run it over something like Mech Rage if you want, and if you find yourself with very high level spiders early on, it can be really annoying for your opponent to deal with, and it will basically require them to get something like Steelballs or a Melter to be able to take it down. But currently, I prefer this type of setup. This brings us to Rhinos. Now on Rhinos, I think Whirlwind and Armor Enhancement are mandatory. Whirlwind is really nice as it allows you to deal with chaff quite effectively, and it can be a really nice flank defender. Armor Enhancement is fantastic as it got buffed. It's really cheap. It gives 50% additional HP plus the armor effect, which can be super effective against things like Vulcans and Mustang, as I said before. Typhoons, same thing. Units that have a very fast attack rate but deal very little damage with each shot. Now, 2 techs here are still available, and Rhino honestly has a lot of viable options. I think currently my preferred setup is something like Photon Coating and Final Blitz. Final Blitz can be a nice gut shot as well, or it can be a nice way to regain some tempo and stop an aggro push if you get some free Rhinos. Photon can be nice as well to be able to ensure that your Rhinos don't get EMP'd in case your opponent wants to try and do such a thing if you already went for, say, Whirlwind or Final Blitz. Other options you could run, you could go for a full like running in setup where you go Mech Rage as well, and you might take off something like Final Blitz. Some people like to run Wreckage Recycling. You could take off Photon for that if you want. Power Armor is also definitely playable, and here you could even go for something like taking off Armor Enhancement and putting in Power Armor if you really want to try and run in with those Rhinos and never have them slowed. But this can be hard to pull off, and so generally speaking, I will go for just one tech on my Rhinos, try and get a round or two of value out of them, and then transition into different units, because these units can be quite vulnerable to be encountered, especially if you leave them on the board for a couple of rounds. So for that reason, I currently like to run this setup. This brings us to Hacker, where we will see range yet again. Barrier is fantastic as it provides so much value. It protects your units. The shield keeps scaling with levels, which is great as well. So just a really nice, solid tech option there. And that leaves you with 3 options. Now, generally speaking, I think I would recommend something like Electromagnetic Interference and Enhanced Control as the most common setup. EMP can be really nice, especially against an Assault Marksman push. If you find yourself up against that, this will allow you to EMP the Assault Marksman. They will temporarily lose their bonus health, get hacked very quickly, and then when the unit becomes yours, the EMP gets removed, and you basically find yourself with a high health Assault Marksman. So this can be really, really nice. Enhanced Control is also a tech that you might find yourself clicking. Let's say that you are dealing with some very high health targets. This may allow you to only hack, say, 5% of the unit, but as soon as it is hacked, it will return to full HP and can be a nice counter to something like a Final Blitz Rhino or a very, very high health target if you're managing to already take it down with your other units. Multiple Control here is also an option. You could run it instead of either EMP or Enhanced Control, depending on your preference. This is a bit more of a niche tech. I very rarely find myself playing this, but it can be nice against some smaller mid-sized units. And it will allow you to deal a bit better with stuff like chaff even though hackers aren't necessarily meant to deal with chaff. As for Wasp, I would recommend range again. Anti-air here I think is really strong. Range and anti-air Wasp basically will beat any air unit that we currently have in the game. Energy shield is very versatile and it allows you to really utilize Wasp as late chaff. Especially if you're playing standard, this can be super useful. Or even if you're pushing, it can allow you to protect important air units like Overlord or Wraith. And it will really slow down units like Phoenix and Marksman. As a final tech option, there are a lot of things that you could go for. You could either go jump drive if you like to play aggressively. This tech can allow you to move a Wasp pack around, try and poke at those towers, and win just some rounds solely off this one unit. Really nice tech. You can also try to go for something like ground specialization if you want to have a bit more oomph and want to try and make your Wasps carry. This will allow them to deal with even some of the beefiest ground units you may encounter. Elite Marksman is also an option if you find yourself with some high level Wasp or maybe the improved Wasp card shows up. This can be amazing for carry Wasp and it will allow you to get the highest possible range on your Wasps. And the other techs I would generally not recommend. I don't think Ignite, EMP, High Explosive and AP are worth it. I have very rarely, if sometimes never even touched these techs. They are available on other units that will do a better job at utilizing those techs. So yeah, now I'm currently running this. If you want to run a full carry setup, you could even go for something like this. That is a final option, especially if you want to play something like Worm Wasp or maybe something like Steelball Wasp. This is a setup that you could try out. But I think the most versatile setup, the one that most people will be able to utilize well, is going to be something like this. As for Phoenix, we will see range enhancement returning and energy shield as well. I think energy shield is great as it allows you to win matchups against something like Marksman if the opponent doesn't run double shot. And it's also quite effective at protecting your Phoenixes from the different spells we have in the game, such as Orbital or sometimes even Lightning Storm. What do you want to add? It kind of depends on your playstyle. If you want to play standard, then I would recommend that you do run something like Elite Marksman and Electromagnetic Shot. Elite Marksman will give you that little bit of extra range to stay safe, even if your opponent wants to go for some, let's say, Fortress with anti-air barrage late game. EMP will allow you to turn off pesky giants on the opponent's board. Something like a Melter, if you find yourself up against that, can be really useful. If, however, you want to play mostly aggro, you can play something like Charge Shot, and you could even contemplate going Jump Drive. Now, I think after the nerfs to this, it's not too great, and so I still prefer playing something like EMP myself, or something like Quantum Reassembly can be fun as well. Quantum Reassembly is very cheap, got buffed a bunch, and together with something like Energy Shield and Charge Shot can really make it so that your Phoenix army just becomes unkillable if your opponent can't reach the Phoenixes and doesn't have the right techs, such as EMP, to be able to shut all of this off. Now this brings us onto Wraith. Here again we'll see a range, and then you have a bunch of options to choose from. I think what I'm currently running is Floating Artillery Array, which will allow you to chaff clear even better with double the amount of guns. This is a very useful tech if you're especially playing something like aggro, or if you manage to snowball one or multiple Wraith, as it will even allow them sometimes to be a carry unit. Degeneration Beam can be useful still, debuffing those enemy units or slowing them down if they are pushing into you can be extremely useful. And then Field Maintenance tends to be the most versatile tank option against the most targets. However, you can also opt out of most of these techs and try and run something else. You can try and run something like degeneration beam, and then both armor enhancement and field maintenance if you want a bit more of a tanky option, and an option that can be very effective against a Mustang response from your opponent. Then armor is going to be really useful. You can also take off degeneration beam and run floating artillery array here instead, and I've even seen some people running something like high explosive instead of 8-gun. If you manage to get some levels on your Wraith, then this can be basically a cheaper option to that floating artillery array if you need to chaff clear a bit better. So yeah, currently I think this would be the setup that I run, or either this. As for Scorpions, you will see that I have already selected 4 techs. That is because Scorpion only has 6 techs available, and everything that you see here, range, double shot, acid, and siege mode, are going to be the options to go for a full carry setup, which I think is the most useful. Range obviously is mandatory. Double shot is going to be really useful against things like barriers, so typhoons with barriers or fortress with barriers. This will allow you to break through those, and in the typhoon case, sometimes even break the shield with the first shot and then kill the unit with the second shot. It also does work together with acid attack, so the first shot will apply the acid and the second shot will immediately get that bonus damage, so this is also a very useful pairing. And siege mode is a bit more niche. You don't see this being teched very often, but having the option available if you're playing standard and you're going for a very long range battle, I think is more useful than having something like field maintenance and armor enhancement. These can definitely be taken if you want to, either or. I would then take off siege mode and run either of these two. But in my experience, it just makes the other techs that you want to get more expensive, and if you want your Scorpion to tank, it also means that it'll be much easier for something like a melter to lock on, and if a melter does lock on, then these techs won't do anything at all. So that's why I would generally recommend this setup. As for Vulcan, range again, I would say Scorching Fire is pretty mandatory. The boost of attack is really nice and can allow you to deal with slightly more leveled chaff units, as well as medium size and sometimes even bigger units, almost giants if your Vulcans are really leveled. And then you have a couple of options to choose from. Incendiary Bomb can be very nice, and I do decide to run this myself. It allows you to deal with different types of pushes, usually, as you can put the fire down, and even if the Vulcan ends up dying quickly, at least you have some of that fire to try and kill the chaff. And you can run something like Best Partner, as this synergizes very well with a classic build, which is going to be Marksman with Vulcans. Getting multiple Vulcans on your board and being able to get this tech late game is going to be really useful if that is a build that you like to go for. Other options you may have, though, is going for both Incendiary and Sticky Oil Bomb. This will allow you to basically just cover the entire ground in front of you with fire. It is near impossible to intercept, and so this will always make sure that the ground is covered in flames. And then you can also decide to go for something like Ignite if you really want to. This is a bit of a specific tech option, and it tends to only be used against war factories, but it can work, and you will be happy having this if you find yourself playing Vulcans and then suddenly a war factory does show up. These are generally the options that you have. The only tech I would recommend not going for would be armor enhancement. This brings us to Melting Point. Now on Melting Point, again, we'll have the classic range. Electromagnetic Barrage is really useful as it allows you to break shields quickly, and the disabling effect is also fantastic, especially once you get into the late game. I would say Energy Absorption has made itself into the mandatory techs for this unit, as it's gotten buffed many times, and the additional health really helps on top of the energy absorption effect, the healing effect. Specifically, if you find yourself playing against fortresses, this is one of the first techs that you will want to be clicking. This leaves you with basically two options. I'm going to not talk about armor in this case. I think that the other options are more useful. So it leaves you with energy diffract and crawler production. Currently, I prefer taking Energy Diffract as it can have its uses defensively, especially if you find yourself against, let's say, a lot of sledges or Steelballs. This can transition the Melter into a unit that is actually able to deal with those, whereas normally it wouldn't be able to. Crawler production you can also go for. This is more of a long-range fight type of tech, but it's been nerfed quite often, and it only produces crawlers now every 36 seconds, and so I prefer going for Energy Diffract, also because this tech has gotten really cheap over the last couple patches. As for Fortress, you will find Barrier, one of the iconic techs for this unit. It's gotten nerfed a lot recently, but I still think it's one of the best techs, if not the best tech on the unit. Being able to protect all of your units in such a wide radius and not having to spend money on bubbles round after round after round is super useful. On top of that, it's a massive shield and it scales fantastically. So really a tech that you should be running. Anti-air barrage, also fantastic tech, super cheap and allows you to deal with almost any air unit you could think of. Mostly deals with Wasps and Phoenixes, but I've even seen it take down boats and Wraith occasionally. So yeah, really, really solid tech. Now that leaves you with a couple options. If you like to play a lot of aggro, what you could go for is something like Fang Production and Rocket Punch. This is a setup that you'd be running if you really want to only play on the line. If you want to be able to defend or play a bit more long range, I recommend something like Range Enhancement and Fang Production. This type of setup will allow you to play forts even in standard against something like Melters. The Fang Production will really make it quite difficult for the Melters to get a good lock, and the range will keep them at bay at least somewhat. For the Fortress is one of the better fighting capabilities. You can take off the Fang Production and run Launcher Overload. This will allow you to even chaff clear with Fortresses. They'll be able to basically kill anything, as their attack interval will be halved down to 0.9 seconds, which is the same attack speed as Arclights currently have, except the unit deals over 6k damage per shot. Currently, I am trying out this, and I usually tended to run the Launcher Overload build. So those are the two things I would try and recommend, kind of depending on your playstyle. And again, I have seen the Rocket Punch and Fang Production build pop up a lot as well. So there's kind of three options there that I think are the most viable. Not talking here about other carry options. Yes, you could technically run something like Range and Elite and Overload and like start taking off units like techs like Anti-Air Barrage and Barrier, but then you're getting into very specific builds that can only do one thing, and I prefer having a bit more versatility for my Fortresses and being able to utilize them in different scenarios. So this would be the build that I would recommend. Now, for Sandworms, I think here there's a lot of options available. Sandworms have been in a bit of a weird position as of late. Previously, Sandstorm was something I would always recommend, but it's been changed and nerfed quite a few times, so I currently actually don't run it, and I think it's better to go for a more Battle Sandworm oriented build. Here, I would go for something like Replicate and Sudden Strike. Replicate can be really good against stuff like Melters to be able to distract them and have them not lock on to your main Sandworm. Sudden Strike can be really, really good, as it allows you to chaff clear a bit better, and then it will also allow for your worms to re-burrow, and that will help you create more larvae. So there's a good synergy here. Now, as for the two techs that you can take, I would maybe recommend going for something like Mech Rage and Anti-Air, as this would create for the most versatile build. Anti-Air is definitely not mandatory though, and neither is Mech Rage, to be honest. So you could take this off to go for something like Armor Enhancement, which is a really cheap way of increasing your Sandworm's HP by 50% on top of that armor effect that it will be getting. Other techs, Burrow Maintenance, I think can be useful, especially if you're playing something like, if you like to play the 4v4 game, or the free-for-all game mode, excuse me, then I think it will be nice to have something like burrow maintenance and anti-air. Reason for this is that you might find yourself facing air units as the battle progresses, and so this could be a nice setup. But if you want to play 1v1 or 2v2, mostly, I think something like the Mech Rage anti-air build here can be quite nice. Overlords. The one tech I think you cannot take off is going to be Photon Emission. The reason is that this is the only photon effect that you can buy that will both cover your air units as well as your ground units, and therefore I think it is too valuable not to have. And then you can basically choose between a different set of builds. Either you can go for something like a full carry boat setup where you run both range enhancement and launcher overload, and then your fourth tech will either be Overlord artillery so that you can also go for the ground cannon builds if you want, or something like mothership if you want to be able to create those wasps and create distractions for the overlords without having to buy wasps yourself. Or you can go for a more aggressive build where you really try and push in, where you go for Overlord artillery, mothership, and jump drive, which will allow you to move the boat around and go for those crucial cheese rounds, try and gut shot the opponent by moving everything to a different side of the board and go in. Currently, I'm trying out a setup where I go for the carry build. So I run this, and Overlord artillery. I opt not to take mothership because I think it's fine to buy your own wasps. As for War Factory, range shows up again. I think missile interceptor is mandatory. This is the best missile interceptor tech available on any unit. You get 4 missile interceptors, which you can see here on the corners, and it does a fantastic job at taking down those missiles and making sure barely any of them get through. Steelball production I put down here as well, because regardless of what build you want to go for, whether that is a spawn factory build or an aggressive factory build, this is usually the best spawn tech option. Which leaves you with a choice. Either you can go battle factory, where you want something like launcher overload and photon coating, and then you have the option to even take something else if you want to, which can be, if you are a bit of a psychopath, you could run armor enhancement for that extra 50% hit points, but you could even go for something like Sledgehammer production here. If you don't want to play battle factory and instead you want to play spawn factory, obviously you're going to need the spawn techs, and then efficient maintenance after the nerf I currently don't think is worth running. I don't think it's viable to buy factories very early on, and so I would generally prefer going for something like launcher overload, but you can consider taking it. So this is a bit dependent on what exactly you want to play. I currently am running this, but efficient maintenance can be argued to take this slot instead if you just want to be able to play spawn factory. This brings us to the final unit that has a choice to be made, which is Fire Badger. I think here range is going to be mandatory. Napalm is still a iconic tech for the unit, allowing you to set the ground on fire wherever the Fire Badger is shooting. It does, however, reduce the hit points quite considerably, and so this is something to take into account, but I think it's still worth running the tech in case you really needed that fire to be on the ground. Scorch is a new tech that I think is worth running. Boosting the damage by 100% could maybe even allow you to deal with stuff like Steelballs or Sledges if your opponent is building those, and then you have a choice to make between Ignite and Field Maintenance. I'm currently running Field Maintenance. Reason is that I don't really see myself flicking Ignite all that often. Fire Badgers don't have a high base range, and so it is rather unlikely that they'll be able to stay safe for long enough to get the 16 seconds that you need to kill something with Ignite, shooting at a particular target. So yeah, those are the techs I'm running. The final 3 mercenary units don't have any tech choices to make. They have got only 4. Oh, I say that. Farseer does have an option. Excuses. Here I decided to run range. EMP is mandatory, I think. It is super cheap at only 100. Missile Interceptor can be great if you are a Farseer specialist and your opponent decides to go for something like early Stormcallers. Then it can certainly be worth to grab yourself even up to 4 Farseer and click this tech, as it is relatively cheap and Farseer tend to stay quite safe with their high base range. And then as the 4th tech, you have a choice between Photon Emission or Scanning Radar. This is really up to preference. I am currently running Photon Emission, but I haven't found myself clicking it, so I might change to Scanning Radar instead. These units, or these techs, really aren't that high priority, and I rarely see them being played. So, that brings us at the end of the video. I hope that I was able to help. If you have any questions remaining, please do drop them below in the comments. I'll try and respond as best I can. If you liked the video, leave a thumbs up. If you want to see me play live, please do check me out on Twitch. And with that being said, please take care and see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye.